friends, and welcome to the CUInsight Network podcast. My name is Lauren Culp. I'm the publisher and CEO at CUInsight.com, and it's my job on this show to have conversations with the thought leaders who support the credit union community. We get to identify those issues that affect credit unions and chat about all the best practices that exist so that we can all learn from one another and improve our credit unions. My guest on today's show, I'm super excited to have Cameron Madill, the CEO and co-owner at PixelSpoke. Cameron, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Lauren. It's great to be on.
I like to start off the show this way. Most of us didn't grow up thinking that we would get to work with credit unions. Did you know what credit unions were when you were younger? And what did you want to be growing up?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I did not grow up thinking I was going to work in credit unions. I did not know who they were. I'm not even sure I knew anything about them until the 2009 recession, when as an entrepreneur, I started realizing belatedly it really matters where you store your money, because I kept hearing about all these entrepreneurs having their lines of credit pulled without any warning from the mega banks. So that was my kind of connection to like, oh, this really does matter. And then, yeah, on a personal level, there's kind of two answers to this question. The first one is, growing up when I was like, let's say 9 or 10, I was very much evenly split between wanting to be a mathematician. I was a huge math fan. I got through I think it was like the equivalent of 10th grade math by 5th grade.
Wow.
I had a teacher who just kind of let me loose, which was just so much fun. I didn't have to kind of follow any structures. I just had to read the books and study the tests. And then I also really wanted to be a writer of stories. I had done some poetry competitions, but even more kind of writing these pretty big, 60, 80 page fantasy stories, which were not amazing, but for a 9-year-old, they were pretty good. And then in college, I wanted you can sort of see where maybe 10 years passed. I was really torn between wanting to be a physicist and a historian. Those were my undergraduate degrees. And I did none of these things, but yeah, that was my background.
That is so interesting. And I think we hear a lot about people who are very, very left-brained or very, very right-brained. So it's interesting that you kind of brought the two together from the math side, from the creative writing side, even at a young age. So I know PixelSpoke is a worker-owned cooperative, a certified B Corp. It's so cool to hear about the work that you all do. It's a really unique and special organization for so many reasons. Can you tell me more about your journey then from, potential physicist and historian to what brought you to running PixelSpoke as the CEO and co-owner, and maybe a bit of the journey of the organization too?
Sure. Great question. So as you could probably tell from all the things I wanted to be, at some point, towards the end of college, I realized it was no longer cute. And people would start looking at me really nervously and kind of be, I could see them thinking oh God, your parents have wasted so much money on your education because you'll just be kind of a dilettante or whatever. So I really ended up just going into business for myself, but with no plan, no strategy, just kind of I think I can teach myself how to build websites. And I actually co-founded the company with my dad. That's a whole nother story. But really, I sort of think on a real simple level, all businesses are kind of trying to get to plan B when they're a startup. They almost never start with the right business model. So I also sort of belatedly realized this. And we went through several evolutions, but maybe a few that really stood out were maybe 3 or 4 years in, I met the first community of entrepreneurs. And I really just didn't know any entrepreneurs growing up. I didn't have any in my friend group. And it was the first time where I felt like I found a home and kind of that passion and that joy in creation and organizing, folks together to accomplish something. So that was sort of one big chapter forward. And that really helped us to start focusing our business model from being kind of all things to all people to wasn't this was amazing, but really focusing on just websites. Instead, we were just kind of all over the place. Then I think the second place where I really felt like I found my people, it was kind of an epiphany of sorts, was when I started going to events for certified B corporations, which for those of you who don't know, it's not a legal status. It's basically, I think, certainly arguably the best and most rigorous certification of a for-profit company's environmental, social, community, and workplace impact. And so to be around people who were just as passionate about optimizing those things as they were about optimizing profits. And in a, jargon alert, synergistic way, they should work together. It shouldn't be one or the other. But that was just so much more inspiring than people whose kind of, vision board or whatever it was basically to have an expensive boat, or whatever, have a huge house or a bunch of houses. So that was kind of another moment where I very much felt like an imposter. It was I don't think we're a social purpose organization. I didn't feel like we belonged, but we worked really hard to sort of meet the certification threshold, made a bunch of changes, and we kind of got to get in the game, so to speak. And then maybe the third big moment where I felt like I really kind of found my people is a group you may have heard of, Lauren. It was through Feline's I3 program, actually, where Lauren and I met, for those of you who don't know. And I think that was sort of we had started focusing a bit more on credit unions. They were, I don't know, at this point, maybe a fifth of our clients or something. But I think that when it was just like, wow, there are some amazing people in this space. And it was similar to B Corp in that it was kind of this energy that, of course, we got to make the business better and be profitable and all of that. But there was this awareness of like a higher calling, a higher responsibility, and that just making profits or financial results is not in and of itself inherently good. It's sort of one of the quips that I really like is that profit is no more the purpose of business than air is the purpose of life. It's a necessary prerequisite to the things that are really meaningful. And so it was like that. And then I think continuing on through the DE program with the foundation and some work I got to do with Inclusive and just meeting all the amazing folks in the credit union space was when I really felt like, okay, these pieces all kind of fit together for who we are as a company. And then I guess I should say, of course, the last big step that we've made that I'm really proud of was we shifted from me being the sole owner to in January of 2020 becoming an employee-owned cooperative. And that's really meaningful. We launched with 5 members in the co-op, worker owners, and now we're up to 10. Wow. And it's something that, sort of like the joke of, credit union people trying to explain what a credit union is to non-credit union people. You got nothing on worker co-ops. There's only like 500 of us. They're pretty small. So most people I talk to just kind of their eyes glaze over or they get really confused. But, it's great that credit union people, I think, pretty intuitively understand cooperative business models. And it's something I'm proud of that we're doing something that really is kind of leading edge and about as far as you can kind of push, for like purpose-driven capitalism is, a democratically governed worker-owned model.
It's so interesting, too. I think back, so Cameron mentioned the Filene I3 program, which is this innovation program that the Filene Research Institute puts on. Cameron, I don't know if you were there when it was in Madison one year, and we went to Isthmus Engineering, which is another worker-owned cooperative. And their model, we joked that only an engineer could understand it because the worker-owned cooperative that they had was very, very detailed and lots of nuance. But it's so cool to hear about, the certified B Corp and all the work that you've gone through on that, and then turning into this worker-owned cooperative. You talked about credit union websites, and for PixelSpoke, I know there's so much alignment when you think about that impact side of the work that you're doing with the mission of credit unions. But I'm curious, what's that elevator pitch that you really give folks about what you do and where you can add some tangible value for credit unions?
Yeah, another great question. I actually just gave a presentation on this last Thursday to a group of entrepreneurs. So anyway, but I'll do the elevator pitch first. But we think of there really being kind of 3 pillars to our core strategy. I guess the reason that presentation I alluded to is relevant is I'm a big believer that strategy is all about focus and simplicity. It's easy to get a bunch of smart people, create all this complexity, but if it's not really like something you can explain to a 5-year-old, that I don't really think it's a meaningful strategy. So on some levels, the most basic strategy we have is websites for credit unions. But of course, if we're talking to a credit union, they want to hear a lot more than that. So the 3 core pillars that we have been built around for, probably 3 years at this point, and there's always more inside of each one. The first one is the combination of best practices and creativity. So being a company that really does understand the credit union model really deeply. So we're not sort of bringing our clients these really innovative new ideas that it turns out are just terrible ideas or things that don't work or that have been tried many times, but also combining that with, not being a templated approach, not being kind of stuck in a rut, which happens a lot with industry focused marketing agencies of any kind, is they can just sort of get formulaic. So that best practices plus creativity, which comes from really having a model that's built on having a small number of clients. We at this point only take on 4 to 6 new clients a year. And so we really get to go deep with each client and, hopefully nail those best practices, but also try to nail that kind of, the individuality of the client. So they stand out in their market. So that's the first pillar, best practices and creativity. The second pillar is digital branch analytics. That is something that has obviously been talked about a lot, but it's thinking about trying to pull together some of the top of the funnel data, how people get to the website, the website data itself, sort of the equivalent of the analogy is sort of that the website is the equivalent of a branch. So what do people do? How do you get people to the branch? What do people do inside of the branch? And then this is where it probably gets hardest, is getting the analytics data on those third-party tools where people apply for a loan or apply to join. And then in many cases, pulling in core data. So you can actually see, from, again, if you take the analogy to a physical branch, like how do we even get in touch with someone outside of the branch? How do we get them to the branch? And then did we get them to actually follow through and apply for a loan? And did we actually fund that loan, or was it rejected? So that's pillar number 2, the digital branch analytics bucket. And then the third one is really all about impact storytelling. And we think of that as kind of using, our own experience and background as a social impact company, in the community of certified B corporations, worker-owned cooperative, and understanding that for credit unions, it's not just about kind of the quantitative results that you need to deliver. It's also about those being able to really connect with like the heart and soul of your members, because that is really where long-term differentiation is going to happen for a credit union versus just being a really well-run commodity. So that's probably a really long answer. That's more like an escalator pitch or an elevator that stops. But those are the 3 things. And the reason I just think it's worth sharing, there's just something I'm passionate about, is that I think like really good strategy usually has these kind of 3 components, and they're kind of unremarkable in themselves, but the combination is the thing that we think makes PixelSpoke unique. So there's a lot of companies that do 1 or 2 of those, but none that we think do all 3.
It's really incredible to hear. And I know one of the things when we hear impact, sometimes we see what I think you've called the big check, where there's the donation and you got the photo op with the giant check. And I think we see that not only from credit unions, but also from banks and other folks in the industry. And you've really described the sweet spot as PixelSpoke as maybe the intersection of credit unions and social impact. And so I'm curious, can you share what that looks like tangibly? And maybe there's nothing wrong with the big check, but how can credit unions really differentiate their impact work in a way that maybe aligns better with that brand and that identity?
Yeah, great question. Something we've done a lot of work on, and I'm really passionate about. Though being on a few boards, a big check can really make, make a big difference. So that's great. But as you said, how do you go beyond that? So we've done a whole bunch of work on this, and we've distilled it down to 3 core components that we call the 3 C's of cause or impact marketing. So the first C is having a really clear core focus. The second C is committing to something big. And the third C is communicating memorably. So a couple quick examples. The really clear core focus is something that versus, we do a lot of good work in our community. It's something that's so clear. It's for a specific stakeholder, and people just get it like that. So a couple easy examples. Tom's Shoes is well known, right? Buy a pair of shoes, have a pair of shoes given to a deserving child in the developing world. That's it. So easy to remember. A couple of credit unions that do it really well. One that we actually is now a client, but we've worked with them for many years, just sort of as allies, is Clean Energy Credit Union. So every dollar you deposit there is only going to fund basically like loans towards things that work on climate resiliency. And so it's just like if you deposit money there, you know how it's going to get used. That's it. There's no complexity. So that's really hard in business, but just that's kind of the gold standard of something that a member or a consumer can just immediately understand, and they can link what they do with the credit union to that cause or impact. Committing to something big is this idea of basically being willing to put kind of a stake in the ground and say, like, this is who we want to be in the future. We're not even sure how we're going to get there. One of my favorite examples of that is this brewery here in Portland, Oregon, where I'm based. And they committed to being a zero waste brewery. And anyone who knows much about breweries, that is incredibly hard. But they put that out there like 5 years ago, and every year they update on it and the progress that they've made. And it really keeps their organization aligned, but also differentiated. And then lastly, communicating memorably. It's really easy to get stuck in just, messaging that just doesn't break through the noise. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do this, but one of my favorite examples is Patagonia, I think the well-known apparel company that is all about the environment and environmental preservation. And they once ran this campaign that I loved, which was a picture of a jacket. And the whole campaign said, don't buy this jacket. And it was a whole list of ways that you could extend the life of your current jacket, reuse it, repair it, etc. Which is just an incredibly, imagine if my company was running paid advertising that says, don't redesign your website, or a credit union was running advertising that said, don't get a car loan. But it really breaks through the noise, and with their target audience, really kind of deepens that connection. So we think those are kind of the core of really going to that next step of having an impact strategy that, both has a lot of impact, but also really creates meaningful differentiation. But the last thing I will say too is, and this is a sort of an hour-long presentation I've done many times, and kind of the end of all this is just start somewhere, start anywhere. I talked about our story at PixelSpoke, how I felt, I should say, like a total imposter when we first became a B Corp. But I think it's that intention, and that any good impact-driven organization, including credit unions, we're all on a journey and we never arrive.
I know social impact, it's so important. It's so critical, really part of the DNA of credit unions, definitely part of the DNA at PixelSpoke. But sometimes it can be hard to measure. And, you hear what gets measured is what gets done. And I know PixelSpoke has really been on a journey to create this culture of analytics over the last year. Can you talk about why that's really so important to you and why it should be so important for credit unions too?
Yeah, and they're often, you're right, Lauren, they're often things that are kind of thought of separately. So the culture of analytics on some levels for us at PixelSpoke was about how do we take this thing, which is important and we've got some skilled people, but how do we make it into a core competency of the entire organization? Because we all know this is where things are going, right? This is not like some brilliant insight, but that, and Feline actually had some really great research on this, that it basically showed that for credit unions who are working on building an analytics competency, that figuring out how to create the culture of analytics was the biggest predictor of success, far more than having internal experts or having leadership team buy-in or all sorts of other things that might seem that way. So for us, it was, I guess many of you probably heard that Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So we felt like we have to build the culture of analytics, and that's maybe the hardest thing of getting all of us to grow and change individually. And then on some levels, the technology and everything else will follow. Linking it to social impact. Yeah, I mean, so I actually personally think it's a misnomer. I think impact is really easy to measure. It's just new and it's not something that we're used to doing. And the B Corporation, the B Impact Assessment, it's called, is out there and it's available to anyone. It's not real fun, right? It's kind of like doing your taxes or maybe a mini NCUA audit, but it is this, wonderfully thoughtful, complex tool that comes up with an overall score in the 5 different impact areas and then an overall score for the organization. And while credit unions aren't eligible right now, US ones, Canadian ones are, has to do with the tax status, I think. It is a free tool that is out there to measure your impact, including on every one of the questions. If you don't get the maximum points, they have resources and links off to ways to improve that score. So I know that there are a lot of Clearwater Credit Union in Missoula. I was just speaking with Christian Federal Credit Union in Detroit, Michigan. And there are a decent number of credit unions that actually use the B Impact Assessment to take this thing that, yes, it feels very murky, but like there's been a lot of innovation and breakthroughs. And to me, that's kind of the easy button to get a holistic measurement of your impact.
But it's so interesting too. I love that you say that it's kind of a misnomer that impact is hard to measure. And sometimes it feels hard to get started. But I love what you say too about, taking small steps and starting somewhere. And I want to talk a moment about climate finance. I know you had kind of alluded to the Clean Energy Credit Union earlier. I know climate finance is a concept that PixelSpoke is really focusing on. I would say really leading the industry in, because we haven't heard a lot of discussion around it, at least not sort of mainstream. But can you explain to our listeners, what is climate finance and maybe what are the implications for credit unions?
Yeah, thank you. That's great to know that we're leaders. It's something we're just really passionate about. So it's kind of just for like anywhere we can help, we like to do that. But yeah, this is all really building on the good work of, in particular, Inclusive and the trainings they've built and Clean Energy Credit Union and lots of other folks. So yeah, I think what I found most helpful from all the experts we've spoken to think about with climate finance is, first off, that there's kind of 2 big buckets. So the first bucket is probably what people most traditionally think of. And that would be something like things that reduce the carbon footprint of a member. So that could be, buying an electric car and, replacing your fossil fuel car. It could be putting solar panels on your house. It could be installing a heat pump instead of a natural gas furnace. It could be weatherization. So those are all things that reduce the carbon footprint of an individual, typically generate significant cost savings for the members. Often it's completely offset. But basically now maybe you don't have to pay for gas for your car, or you don't have to pay for electricity for your house or whatever it might be. So that's kind of in the sort of like climate carbon reduction area. The other big area that's really interesting is in the mitigation or resiliency space. And so this is on some levels, it could be something like, reinforcing the foundation of a house if you're in an area that is becoming, increasingly hurricane prone. It also could be things like solar panels so that if the grid goes down, it could be, there's some credit unions that have done things like they have funded disaster shelters so that, if as natural disasters keep getting more and more common, if something occurs, that their communities have a place to go, which will be safe and secure. So those are the two big buckets. And I think, it's really important to think about, as you said before, Lauren, kind of like where to start, because I think every journey starts somewhere. Another thing that I found really interesting is that there's some pretty interesting data about how a lot of these things are really great choices for credit unions to make. You both have a lot of money flowing into the space from the Inflation Reduction Act, but you also have, there's some interesting data out there. You can split hairs with this, but that if you put, for example, solar panels on your house, not only will you be able to offset the cost of the loan directly with your power bill, so it's a very secure and wise decision for the consumer versus maybe a loan that funds something more discretionary, but also that it will increase the value of the house, in some cases by 100% the cost of the solar panels. And this was from Zillow, so I thought it was reasonably independent data. So there's a lot to say that it's not just, sort of in the quip from the social impact space of doing good, doing well and doing good as an organization. This really seems to be kind of like a no-brainer bullseye for I think really all credit unions. And I think maybe the last point I would make there is, unless you've been, I don't know, sleeping in a hole in the ground for the last 2 decades, we live in a very polarized society, which is unfortunate because it makes it hard to talk about anything with nuance. But obviously, like, climate change is incredibly nuanced and complicated. There's some deep fundamental truths, but there's a lot of nuance and complexity to it. And so one thing that we've seen is, different messages resonate in different places. And I thought this was kind of obvious in retrospect, but that a lot of places that have, really robust fossil fuel industries have shifted towards messaging around things, less of like climate change or climate emergency or climate crisis to things like energy independence. And so finding that message that resonates best with their membership and their communities, because these are really things that are kind of no-brainers and can benefit everyone if we can facilitate the financing.
So many interesting stories that you share. And I think that the idea of climate finance hopefully will become more and more mainstream as it sort of becomes a little bit more urgent. And as we look to the future, I know the economy is on everyone's mind right now, but what are the other new trends that you're seeing emerging in financial services? And what would you say is PixelSpoke's big focus for the road ahead?
All right, I'm going to try to keep this short. I have 2 brief stories. This is what came to my mind when I was thinking about this yesterday, Lauren. So the first one was an interaction I had with Kaiser Permanente, who's PixelSpoke's health insurance provider. Maybe TMI, I apologize for all of you, but I got a rash on my right wrist and it was annoying and it was kind of painful. And so I opened up their secure portal after ignoring it for like a couple weeks, and I sent a message to the advice nurse. I got a response back within an hour and they said, yep, it does sound like eczema. And here's a prescription for something, which I can't remember what it's called. And I was like, okay. And then I sort of poked at it a little bit. And then I was like, ooh. And I clicked a button and it took me to their online shipping site. And literally 2 days later, it showed up on my doorstep for a $5, copay. That to me was just like, this is awesome, because in the past, I would have had to make an appointment with my primary care physician. Then I would have had to have gotten a referral to a dermatologist. Then I would have gotten a prescription that I would have had to take into a pharmacy or driven to a pharmacy. And instead, it all just like happened like that, for something that, right, this is not an emergency. I could have just waited till spring and it would go away when the weather gets better. But it was like a brilliant experience for me as a consumer. Like, it just left me being like, God, I love Kaiser. The other story I was thinking of was, I'm an avid smoothie maker. I have them almost every morning. And I've been a big fan of a company called BlendTech. I've bought 3 blenders over the last decade. And a big part of why was their amazing customer service, because at one point I had a blender fall apart, basically just stop working. And I had a very short phone call, talked to them, and they sent me like a refurbished blender. It was there like 3 days later, even though it was like 6 years after I'd bought it. Wow. So I was a big promoter. Unfortunately, my most recent blender I bought also, had an issue happen. I filled out a warranty claim on their site. went back and forth on email, had people start ghosting me on email, called their 1-800 number, would get these things that, that you'll be talk to a representative in an hour, sent direct emails to their support email. And this went on, I mean, it's like 5 weeks in. I finally did something I never do, which is I left a grumpy Amazon review, just hoping that anyone would respond to me. And then the interesting thing is I finally got through on a phone call the other day and they were great. But I spent a month just ping-ponging around, without a blender, a brand new product I had bought in August with a 10-year warranty. So I share these two stories because I think it's not something really new. It's organizations, at least in the one area I shared, like Kaiser, that sort of took all the lessons of the pandemic where they were forced into telehealth. They were forced into doing mail order pharmacy, but they took those and kind of like have now added those on as core competencies. And now, again, at least in that example, I'm not saying they're perfect, but they were able to just create a brilliant experience for me in the channel that I wanted. And sort of to the appropriate degree. And I love that example too, because healthcare is another highly regulated industry, right? They're dealing with HIPAA and all this other stuff. So those two stories are just to capture that. I think like what we're really focused on at PixelSpoke is, I think it's that sort of what we've called that digital plus human experience, that is kind of, and there's a lot that underlies that, right? Getting more control of our own data and data warehousing and personalization and all of that. But I think that is the core opportunity and challenge that financial services really has right now coming out of the pandemic, to say, how do we take the digital competencies that we built and pair them with the historically great and human service that we've had for our members to be much more versatile and be able to meet people where they want to be met.
One of the most interesting things that I had heard recently was someone talking about how, and we've heard it over and over again, but it just kind of clicked home for me of good member service now looks like a good digital experience. You may never, ever have to talk to someone. And for credit unions that have been so good about member service for so long, I think that's a tough shift to navigate sometimes, because it's that digital competency that, we're such nice people. We're so great. We've got the member in mind. But if they don't feel that the ease of use is there, then they're not feeling that good member experience. So it's so critical to keep in mind.
Yeah, well said.
Well, as we wrap up the show, and Cameron, I feel like we could talk all day. I have so many other things that I want to pick your brain about, but as we wrap up here, in the interest of time, I always like to have some fun with rapid fire questions. Let our listeners get to know you a little bit better. And we like to say the questions are rapid. Your answers don't necessarily have to be. So if you're ready, we will dive into part 2.
Let's do it.
All right. First question. What's a recent purchase you didn't know you needed, besides a blender, that has become something that you can't live without?
It's my blender, though. Like, what else could it be? All right. Other than my blender, which I love, I bought a Frou Frou espresso machine in like May of 2020. And I just thought, if I'm going to get through this, I got to have great coffee. So it was I guess I'm a pusher today, Lauren. It was the Breville Bambino. Oh my God, I love that machine. I've used it probably thousands of times in the last few years.
Okay, we're going to link to that, and I may go check out the listing myself. When you hear the word success, who's the first person that comes to mind for you, and why?
All right, I'm going to tug at the heartstrings. It's just my parents. I just think they're such amazing people, and they, I think, have I don't want to say unique, but it's a really uncommon combination of sort of like really high functioning professional success, but like really deep grounding in like the things that really, really matter. So my dad was a very successful IT executive, technology executive. My mom was a, very successful doctor, but they just always kind of put family and community first. And they've just kind of always been an inspiration in that sense. And sometimes in kind of like a really annoying way where it's like, I just know that they're just kind of asking like, but what's the right thing to do? And, sometimes that's so annoying because it's like, but. And so I really look up to them and just am grateful for my relationship with them and everything they've taught me.
I love that. All right. A random question. What are you listening to most right now?
Okay. So as I didn't touch on this, I was a former jazz musician, spent a couple years trying to play professionally. I wasn't that good, but I worked really hard at it. And I just mostly listened to like jazz and classical. So what I've been listening to most recently is actually an opera, La Boheme from Puccini, which I've never seen. I don't actually really like watching opera. but one of the melodies just popped into my head on a run last week. And so I've just had it on repeat.
That is incredible. That's the first time we've ever gotten that answer. So we'll link to that for any of our listeners today. Any books that you have gifted or you think just everyone should read?
Okay, so I love reading. PixelSpoke.com/Cameron's-lists. If anyone wants to join me on my nerdy reading journey, I list every book I've read in the last decade on there. All right, I will pick 3. I read a book called CEO China, which is a book about Xi Jinping, arguably the most powerful person in the world, who has kept an unbelievably low profile. And it's just fascinating to learn more about kind of his background and what motivates him. I also just finished a book called How to Hide an Empire, which is a really fascinating story about the sort of so-called greater United States. So everything that either has been or is currently a territory, but not a state. So, modern day, that'd be places like Puerto Rico, but also the history of, the Oregon territories and everything outside of the original colonies, and just kind of how they were governed and what the legal structures were, which was super, super interesting. And then lastly, I'll recommend a book called The Lincoln Highway, which was a fiction work by one of my favorite authors, Immortals. It's just this he writes these books that are they're so uplifting. And who doesn't need uplifting things in this day and age? It's a kind of wonderful story of 2 young teenagers who make their way from the center of the country all along, I guess, I didn't know this, the Lincoln Highway out to New York, and just their whole journey and all these kind of foibles and things that happen to them. That's just really fun and uplifting. All
right. Well, we're going to link to those for folks too. And of course, to the reading list you shared. Let's say the calendar is empty. I can't imagine that given, all the things that you've said you're interested in and working on. But if the calendar was empty, what are you doing to unwind outside of work?
Yeah. This is totally unoriginal for someone who lives in Portland, Oregon, but I would say I really love to spend time in nature. So in particular, there's one of my favorite places in the world is called Trout Lake Abbey. It is a Buddhist monastery / druidic retreat / organic farm. It is the most eclectic combination of things I've ever seen. And they just have these tiny huts that you can rent. And I just go up there by myself, and it's you can see Mount Adams. It's in this beautiful, beautiful valley, and it's just green and lush and beautiful and peaceful. So that's what I would do if I can get the time.
Get away. All right. I love that. Well, we're going to link to everything we talked about today in the show notes. But our last question for you before we wrap is, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share? Final asks of our listeners today?
I'm curious, did you make it this far in the podcast? I feel like I talked a whole bunch. No, I was really appreciate the opportunity. Let's see, I guess looking back, yeah, I would just say, my big passion is all about the intersection of business and social impact. And part of what I've said in presentations is credit unions are the original social enterprise. They were built to meet a huge need in their communities. So that is our DNA as credit unions. And so on some levels, I think it's both, I sort of view it as a combination of name it and claim it. This is who we are as credit unions. But because I think that legacy goes back so many decades versus having a founder in the last decade or whatever, credit unions aren't as bold about naming and claiming what they do and why it matters. And then just kind of the flip side of that coin is just start somewhere, figure out how to get a little bit better at measuring impact or building impact more formally into your strategic planning process. Because I truly believe that is the most durable and meaningful path towards long-term success and differentiation for credit unions.
Well, what a great way to wrap up the show. Thank you so much, Cameron, for being with us today. I hope you stay well. Hope to run into you again soon, but depending on what the travel schedule is looking like, but hopefully get to do that. And thanks to all of our listeners today for tuning into the CUInsight Network podcast. We will be back again next time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.